people, call your next witness.
At this time, the people called Doug Daus.
Witness entering. State your full name, spelling your last name.
Douglas Daus, D-A-U-S.
Your county of residence?
Westchester County.
Good afternoon, you may inquire.
Thank you, Judge. Where do you work?
I work for the New York County District Attorney's Office.
How long have you worked in the District Attorney's office?
It will be 10 years in July.
Where do you work in the DA's office?
HTAU, High Technology Analysis Unit.
What does HTAU do?
Process all types of digital evidence that comes through our lab to this office. We take extractions from this type of evidence and produce reports for them.
How long have you worked at HTAU?
It will be 10 years in July.
Can you tell us a little bit about your educational background?
I have a degree in psychology. I've been in this field a number of 20 years. I have a number of industry standard certifications as well.
Can you tell us about some of your certifications?
Certainly. One is a CCME, a Celebrite Certified Mobile Examiner. Another one would be a Certified Computer Examiner.
Where did you receive that training?
That training has been over the years that I've been accompanied with this type of job. It comes from the company itself, for Celebrite. The other certification happens to be an internal body of trainees and trainers.
Can you tell us about your experience in the field and your work history?
Certainly. So before the 10 years here, I worked 2 years for Guidance Software. It was a company that created OnCase. It's software that does forensics. 2 years prior to that, I was embedded in the military in Iraq, doing the same type of work here.
When were you in Iraq?
From end of April 09 to when we closed in November of 2011.
And what were you doing over there?
Same type of work as here.
What's your current role in HTAU?
I'm a supervising computer forensic analyst.
Can you just give a brief description of what computer and phone forensics means?
It means that when we get a device that is a computer or phone, we then process that device. At that moment, we take a digital copy of the entire evidence, preserve it, and then work with that copy to perform an analysis of those devices.
Can you describe your day-to-day responsibilities as a supervising analyst in HTAU?
Besides the daily supervision of the lab, keeping up with technology, software, hardware, I am also an analyst, so any type of cases that come my way, I may also perform the extractions and produce reports for them.
What kinds of devices do you analyze on a day-to-day basis?
Cell phones primarily. It could be computers as well, thumb drives, iCloud accounts. Actually anything that would contain digital media.
In the time you've been in HTAU, about how many devices have you analyzed?
Here, as of today, 3,392.
Approximately?
Approximately.
How many of those are phones?
Anywhere from 80 to 90% are phones.
So thousands of phones?
Yes.
Does HTAU have a standard intake procedure for when the unit receives digital evidence?
We do.
Can you describe that intake procedure that HTAU uses?
So, once an intake email is set up from the attorneys to our department, typically devices will come in either pursuant to a search warrant or a consent form. Those devices then come to our office. We will examine them, take pictures of them, label them, keep records of those licenses, and then produce chain of custody forms, and then begin the extractions and analysis.
Would it be routine for the person doing intake to know what authority HTAU has to do the search of the device?
We don't do any devices without such.
That's where you mentioned search warrant or consent?
That is correct.
Briefly, what is a search warrant?
A search warrant is authority from a judge that signs, that allows us to examine the devices obtained for our search warrant.
What is consent?
Consent, just simply the owner of the device consents to the examination of the device.
Once the intake has been done, what happens to the device?
Once the intake is done, it is assigned an analyst. In this case, it would have been me. We then look at the search warrant or consent form, make sure all the numbers are correct, and then proceed with the extraction of devices.
Would it be fair to say that the person who does the intake is not always the person that does the analysis of a particular device?
Not always, that's correct.
Have you yourself extracted data from and performed analysis on smartphones, including Apple iPhones?
Yes, I have.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the extraction process, specifically for a cell phone?
Depending upon whether it's an Android or an Apple iPhone, we then take it into a particular room. If we have a PIN code to it, then we'll proceed with the extraction of the device.
When you say, if we have a PIN code, what do you mean?
In consents, we are usually provided the PIN code.
You mean the password?
That is correct.
What types of tools or programs do you use to extract data from smartphones or cell phones?
As mentioned before, Celebrite is one of them. Graykey is another one.
What do those tools do when they're extracting information from the phone? What does it extract?
It extracts the entire content of the device and puts it in a format that's readable by the format itself.
When you say content of the device, is that data?
That is all the data on those devices.
How do you read that data once it's been extracted?
We use, again, the software called Celebrite to then take the contents of those devices and put it into a meaningful format.
Once it's in that format, what kinds of things can you look at from the extraction?
Anything that you would normally see on the device, your call history, your contacts, your text messages, videos, pictures, and such.
In that process, is any of the data on the phone changed in any way?
We're dealing with a live phone, so perhaps some things in the background like software. But for all intents and purposes, things do not change.
Can withdrawn. What kinds of data specifically can be extracted from a smartphone?
Text messages, all types of software, call history, log files, anything that is normally on a phone.
Can you get contact lists?
You can.
Pictures?
Pictures.
Calendar entries?
Calendar entries.
Audio recordings?
Audios.
Can you pull the phone number associated with the smartphone?
Absolutely.
The username?
The username.
Can you get emails?
You can.
And can you get downloaded apps?
Yes, you may.
Can you also get something called metadata?
You can.
Can you tell us a little about what metadata is?
Simply, metadata is data about data. To give an analogy, let's say you look at a book. Before you open it up, you may see the title of it, maybe the author, but you don't know who published it, who wrote it, and when it was done. You would simply open up the book cover, and that's the information that would be considered metadata.
How is that metadata on the phone created?
It's created by the year and/or the operating system itself and applications.
And does that depend on what kind of metadata it is?
It just depends on the artifact.
As part of your work in HTAU, were you assigned to an investigation involving Donald Trump?
I was.
Were you assigned to 2 devices to analyze as part of that investigation?
Yes, I was.
What kinds of devices?
There are 2 iPhones. The first one is an iPhone 6S, and the second one is an iPhone 7.
Did you understand the authority that HTAU had to be in possession and look at those 2 phones?
As mentioned before, it was a consent.
And whose consent, if you know?
The consent was Michael Cohen.
And do you know whose phones those were?
They were Michael Cohen's.
Did one of the phones that you received have a gold case?
It did.
Was that the 6S?
That was...
Did you assign an identifier to that phone to use within HTAU?
I did.
What was the identifier?
CP0001. CP stands for cell phone.
Is that sort of a standard practice in a particular case? You would name any phone CP001 through any phones?
That's correct.
Is that okay if I call that CP1 going forward?
Yes.
Do you recall the last 4 digits of the phone number for that phone?
0114.
Did you note the serial number of that phone?
I did. I don't recall it.
Is there something that could refresh your recollection?
Notes would, yes. The one.
Just for the parties in the court and the witness, could we display those notes?
Is there an identification of it? Mark it for identification.
We could mark that as Peoples. Just one moment, Judge.
Whereupon the people confer.
If we could mark that as Peoples 511A.
Thank you.
Whereupon the exhibit is shown on the witness's screen and on the parties' screens.
Mr. Daus, take a look at that. Does that refresh your memory what the serial number for phone is?
Yes, it does.
Tell us what it was.
Delta November Papa Quebec Charlie 0 Hotel Golf Ralph Yellow and 3.
And if I may, to put that into the regular alphabet, is that DNPQ Cohigri 3?
That is correct.
Did the other phone that you received have a black case?
It did.
Was that the iPhone 7?
It was.
Was an identifier assigned to this phone?
It was.
What was that?
CP0002.
Is that okay if I refer to that as CP2 going forward?
Yes.
Do you remember the last 4 digits of the phone number for that phone?
6866.
Again, do you remember the serial number for that phone?
I do not.
If we could pull up what I would deem marked Peoples 15, Peoples 511B, just for the parties and the witness.
Whereupon the exhibit is shown on the witness's screen and on the parties' screens.
Take a look at that and tell us if it refreshes your recollection.
It does.
What was the serial number?
F1LST2 PGK.
Thank you. You can take that down. When you received the phones to forensically examine, do you recall if CP1 and CP2 were powered on or powered off?
They were off.
Did each of these 2 devices go through the intake process as you just described for us?
Yes, they did.
Did you do the intake yourself?
I did not.
Once you were assigned the phones, what did you do with them?
Once I received the phones, I kind of mentioned before, I take them to what's called our F room, our Faraday room, Faraday. It's a room that separates the room from outside sources so there's no interference. We'll then plug that into a device, hardware device, and then proceed, after given the passcode, to extract the data from the device.
Once you did all of that, did you end up with a full forensic extraction on each of the data on CP1 and CP2?
It was a full extraction.
We talked a little about this. In layman's terms, could you explain for the members of the jury what full forensic extraction means?
It's just an extraction from the beginning of the storage device to the end of it, meaning it captures all the data.
If I could hand the witness a thumb drive that contains People's Exhibits 246 to 266. Mr. Daus, before testifying here today, did you have a chance to review each of these exhibits that are marked as People's 246 to 266 on the thumb drive?
I did.
Is that the same thumb drive that you reviewed?
Yes, it is.
How do you know that?
I dated it and initialed it after examining it.
Are all of the exhibits on the thumb drive, except for People's 248, which we'll come back to, an exact copy of portions of data forensically extracted from either CP1 or CP2?
Yes, they are.
This thumb drive, for the record, I will note, contains People's 255 and People's 266, which are already in evidence. One moment.
Whereupon the people confer.
I'm sorry, it's 255 and 265, which are both already in evidence. Mr. Daus, when you reviewed those exhibits, did you see redactions in many of the exhibits?
Yes, I did.
Did you, as you were looking at the exhibit on the thumb drive, look at both an unredacted and redacted copy of each of the exhibits?
Yes, I did.
Where there were redactions were the exhibits, but for the redactions, the same as the corresponding exhibit without redactions?
Yes, they were.
What kinds of information was redacted on the exhibits that you were looking at with redactions?
The parties' names.
Was it primarily personal identifying information, names, email addresses, phone numbers, that kind of thing?
Yes, it was.
Did you review each of these exhibits, except for Exhibit 248, against the data that you forensically extracted from either CP1 or CP2, depending which it came from, to make sure that each of the exhibits contained exact copies of the portions of data that you extracted from each of the phones?
Yes, I did.
Other than People's 248, do People's Exhibits 246 to 266 contain exact copies of data extracted from CP1 or CP2?
Yes, they do.
Judge, at this time I'd like to offer as into evidence People's 246, 247, 249 to 254, 256 to 264, and 266.
Any objections?
No, Your Honor.
Accepted into evidence.
Now, I want to first talk about the group exhibits, numbers 249 to 251, 255, which was already in evidence, 257 to 260, and 262. Are each of those Celebrate reports created from the extraction that you did on CP1?
Yes, they are.
And are they all text messages with Michael Cohen as one of the parties? And with respect to each of the exhibits, are different parties corresponding with Michael Cohen?
Yes, they are.
I would like to pull up an example just to go through what a report looks like. You can pull this up for everybody. You can pull up People's 259.
Whereupon an exhibit is shown on the screens.
If you look at those, who are those texts between?
The parties would be the owner of the phone, Michael Cohen, and Hope Hicks.
And can you tell us the last 4 digits of Hope Hicks's phone number?
226.
Now, could you just tell us a little bit about each of the columns that's blown up there? First of all, is this format what you would see in one of the Celebrate reports that you were talking about earlier?
Yes, it is.
So this was data extracted from the phone and then put into a Celebrate report?
That's correct.
Can you tell us about each of the columns, the header columns on this exhibit?
Certainly. The first one is self-explanatory, the date. Your next column is the time, then the parties. The description is the content of the message, and the source is just what particular artifact it came from, being the native messaging app.
Okay, that's sort of where the data lived on the phone?
Yes,
When you say description, that's the body of the text?
that's correct.
I want to talk a little bit about the time here. In your work, have you become familiar with different time zones and how timestamps work on different phones and other devices?
Yes, I have.
Are you familiar with UTC?
Yes.
What is UTC?
Universal Time Coordinated basically stands for the old way of weighing time, GMT, Greenwich Mean Time. We're on an Earth with 24 time zones, so one place starts with 0. There are a few zones that go around. New York here, we're either 2 different times depending upon when it changes twice a year. So it would be UTC -4 or UTC -5.
Meaning if the time up there says 7 hours, 9 minutes, and 12 seconds p.m. UTC -4, what time zone is that time in?
So it's already converted to Eastern Standard Time, so it's 7:09 p.m.
And you mentioned the time change either being UTC -4 or UTC -5. Does that relate to daylight saving time?
Yes, it does.
If we could now pull up people's 263 in evidence, is this a report of contacts from CP1? Is this a report of contacts from CP1?
Yes, it is.
How many contacts were in on CP1?
39,745.
Is that unusual?
That is unusual.
In what way?
I've not seen contacts that many being on a phone.
What would be an average number of contacts that you would see when you do this kind of examination of a phone?
Maybe hundreds.
Hundreds, maybe thousands?
Thousands. 1,000 at the most.
Can we pull up a few examples of the contacts from the phone? First, could we pull up, this is 3 pages of contacts that were on CP1 for David Pecker. Is that what that is?
Yes.
Could we next pull up, is this 2 pages of contacts for Hope Hicks? The next one.
Yes, it is.
Could we also look, is this the next 12 pages of contacts for Alan Weisselberg?
Yes, it is.
And finally, could we pull up, is this 3 pages of contacts for Donald Trump?
Yes, it is.
Now, if you recall, was this all the pages of accounts for Donald Trump?
No.
Do you remember how many pages of contacts for Donald Trump were on CP1?
I think there were 10.
We're not going to pull up additional pages, but did the contacts on CP1 also include contacts for Dylan Howard?
Yes.
Keith Davidson?
Yes.
Keith Schiller?
Yes.
Melania Trump?
Yes.
Rona Graff?
Yes.
Jay Sekulow?
Yes.
Larry Rosen?
Yes.
Daniel Rothstein?
Yes.
And Gary Farrow?
Yes.
Could we now quickly pull up what's in evidence as People's 264? Is this the contacts from CP2?
It is.
How many contacts were on this phone?
385.
Is that more what you're used to seeing?
Yes.
If we could next pull up People's 256. Is this an example of emails that were pulled off of CP1?
They are.
I, again, just want to kind of walk through for the jury the different columns that we see in. Is it okay if I call this a Celebrite report?
Yes, you can.
Can you walk us through the headers of the columns and explain a little bit about what the information is in each column?
Certainly. There's the date, the time, which is also in, posted by the date, the party, between the 2 parties sending and receiving emails, the description and the source, just saying that it's from emails.
Who are the parties on this?
From Patty to Michael Cohen.
What's Patty's email, the end of her email address?
That's tdelaneycorporate.com.
Thanks. If we could next pull up what's in evidence as People's 253. Taking a look at People's 253, is this a photograph that you pulled up from CP1?
It is.
Do you know who that is in that photograph?
I do.
Who is that?
That's Michael Cohen.
Have you ever met Michael Cohen?
I haven't.
Sorry?
I have not, sorry.
How do you know that that's him?
I watch a lot of news.
And do you know, can you tell from looking at that where that photograph was taken?
Looks like the White House.
If we could now pull up what's in evidence as People's 252, and if you could blow that up a little bit. Thank you. Mr. Daus, what is this?
This is, as mentioned before, the metadata about that picture.
And can you tell us, what does that metadata tell us about that picture? If you could sort of explain that as you walk through the columns.
All right, so you have modified time, created time, access time. They are all on February 8th of 2017 at approximately 5:39 p.m.
Okay, and what does each of those things mean?
It just means that those are the dates, the times that existed on that phone.
Okay, and does that mean that's when that photo was created?
Yes.
Okay. If we could now pull up what's in evidence as People's 254. And if you could blow that up a little bit, is this a copy of a calendar invite?
Yes, it is.
Again, a Celebrite report?
That's correct.
So this was extracted? This is part of your forensic extraction of the phone?
Yes, it is.
What, can you tell us again the date and sort of walk us through the columns?
As mentioned before, so date, time, and description February 8th, 2017 at 4:30 p.m. of a calendar event. The description is called Meeting with POTUS.
And again, up there, can you tell us about the time zone? You see UTC -5. Can you tell us what time zone this is in?
Eastern Standard Time. This is before the time changes in March. This is February, so that's why it's -5.
Could we now look at People's 261 in evidence? What's this report?
It's another report of a call log from the WhatsApp application that existed on the device.
What is a call log?
A call log is just a log that identifies when calls were made.
And you said it was from an app called WhatsApp?
That's correct.
What is WhatsApp?
WhatsApp is an app, an encrypted app that users use to communicate with each other.
And you said, what is an encrypted app?
It just means that the conversation between you and the next party is encrypted. It can't be intercepted and/or vetted.
WhatsApp is an example of that type of an app?
It's an example.
Did you find other encrypted apps on either CP1 and/or CP2?
I did.
Which ones did you find, if you remember?
Telegram and Signal.
Now, if you recall, was People's 265, which is in evidence and was already in evidence, an audio recording that you extracted from CP2?
Yes, it was.
Could we pull up what's in evidence as People's 266? And if you could blow that up a little bit, what is People's 266?
This is the information about the recording.
Is this the metadata for that recording?
It is.
And what's the title of that recording?
The title was labeled Keith Davidson, October 16th, 2017.
And was that recording made, if you know, on October 16th, 2017?
It was.
And how do you know that?
Based upon the application called Voice Memos, how it names the file itself and keeps track of the timestamp that is embedded within the file.
And do we see that same date in some of the other columns?
Yes, we do.
Including in the timestamp date column?
That is correct.
And also the timestamp time column?
Yes.
And again, that's all metadata forensically extracted from CP2?
That is correct.
Now, can we look at People's 247? And if we could blow that up a little bit, is this the metadata for this audio recording?
It is.
And can you walk us through the columns here and walk us through the title and what kind of file this is and the date and time it's created?
The title is entitled New Recording 3, which indicates that there are 2 previous recordings on the Voice Memo app on the iPhone. It's just an audio recording. It's on the app, which is the audio recording software. It gives the date and timestamp of September 6, 2016, at approximately 10 hours 56 minutes and 42 seconds a.m. in the morning, Eastern Standard Time, with a duration of 2 minutes and 51 seconds. The link is just the name of the file again, and the end is just the source. Every file has a source path where it exists on the device.
Now, People's 246 is an audio file. It's not a recording that you were able to forensically extract from CP1, right?
That is correct.
Did you have a chance to listen to People's 246?
I did.
And if we could, just for the parties and the judge, take a look at what's marked or what's in evidence as People's 248. I'm sorry. What had been marked for identification as People's 248? Mr. Daus, do you recognize what this is?
I do.
What is that?
That's a transcript of that aforementioned audio.
Is it a transcript of approximately 46 seconds of the audio file that is People's Exhibit 246?
Yes, it is.
Is that recording longer than 46 seconds?
It is.
So this is a transcript just of the last 46 seconds of that recording?
That's correct.
Did you have an opportunity to compare that transcript to the last 46 seconds of that recording as you were listening to it?
I have.
Is the transcript a fair and accurate rendering of the words that you hear, what you listen to, the last 46 seconds in People's 246?
To the best of my ability.
At this point, I would offer People's 248 into evidence.
Any objections?
No, Your Honor.
Accepted into evidence.
If we could now click People's 248, or actually, can you pull that down for a minute? And if we could play People's 246 and then stop it when we get to 46 seconds from the end, and then I will ask to put the transcript up on the screens.
Audio playing.
Let me know what's happening, okay? Oh. Oh. Maybe because of this it would be better if you didn't go, you know? Maybe because of this, for that one, you know, I think what you should do is get rid of this because it's so false what they're saying. It's such bullshit. I think this goes away quickly. I think it's probably better. Do the Charleston thing. just this time. Yeah. In 2 weeks, it's fine. I think right now it's better. You know? Okay, honey. You take care of yourself. Thanks, Pam. Yep, I'm proud of you. So long. Bye. What's up, Mike?
Great poll, by the way.
Yeah.
Seen it. Great poll.
Making progress.
Big time.
And you guys are good guy.
Hello, Pastor
I
Scott.
can't believe he's... No, Pastor Scott. What's
Oh,
happening?
no. He's...
Can we use him anymore?
Oh, yeah. 100... No, you're talking about Mark Burns. We've told him
Well,
to...
I don't mean that. Mark Burns, can we use him?
No.
anymore?
No.
Richard Lefraff, I'm sorry, Richard Lefraff just called. He just had, we have a chance, he had an idea for you.
Okay. So we got served from the New York Times. I told you this. We were regarding to unseal the divorce papers with Ivana. We're fighting it. Kasowitz is going
We
to...
should never be able to get that done.
Never. Kasowitz doesn't think they'll ever be able. They don't have a...
Give me your coat, please.
They don't have a legitimate purpose.
And you have a woman that doesn't want to unseal.
Correct.
So you've been handling it.
Yes, and it's
That's
all
been going on for a while.
for about 2-3 weeks now.
All you have to do is delay it for...
Even after that, it's not going to ever be opened. There's no purpose for it.
Can we pull up the transcript? And if we can play the last 46 seconds.
Audio playing.
Told you about Charleston. I need to open up a company for the transfer of all of that info regarding our friend David. So that I'm going to do that right away. I've actually come up and
Give it to me.
I've spoken to Alan Weisselberg about how to set the whole thing up with
So what are we going to pay?
funding. Yes, and it's all the
Yeah, I was
stuff.
thinking about that.
All the stuff, because you never know where that company, you never know where he's going to
Maybe
be.
gets hit by a truck.
Correct. So I'm all over that, and I spoke to Alan about it when it comes time for the financing, which will be.
Listen, what financing?
We'll have to pay you. So
I'll pay with cash.
no. I got no. Hey, no. How are you?
And just so the record is clear, the metadata that we just looked at, that was People's 247, is the date and time that recording was created. Is that right?
It is.
One moment. Thank you, Judge. Nothing further.
Any cross?
Yes, Judge, thank you. May I inquire?
Yes.
Thank you, Judge. Is it Mr. Daus? Am I saying that right?
That's correct.
My name is Emil Bove. I represent President Trump. It sounded to me like you started your career in forensics in Iraq.
I didn't start it in Iraq, but before that, actually.
You did some work over there, and I think you said that work is similar to what you are doing for the district attorney's office.
That's correct.
But there are some differences, right?
Yeah.
And to me, one of the differences breaks down to the difference between intel collection and the presentation of evidence in criminal cases, correct?
Sure.
Do you know what I mean by intel collection?
A collection of things that are important for national security.
Right. And in Iraq, you were doing that essentially on a battlefield, more or less, right?
In a lab, yes.
And it was important to get information to parties who could use it as quickly as possible, right?
Absolutely.
That is, in that setting, in the intel setting, that's probably the top priority.
I would say.
And it's not necessarily a top priority in connection with a criminal investigation, right?
I do the same thing on every case.
Well, the integrity of the data matters more in a criminal case than on a battlefield, doesn't it?
I would say so, sure.
Because different rights are at stake.
Certainly.
And so things that you might be able to do more quickly outside the United States requires more caution in the United States, right?
Yes.
And that's the distinction that I'm trying to touch on. There are some procedures that you follow here in the U.S. that are just different than what you were doing outside the U.S.
That's correct.
And you work in a department now that, how do you say the acronym, HTO?
HTO.
Which is basically a multi-million-dollar cyber lab.
Yes.
Funded in part by the district attorney's office and some others.
That is correct.
And it sounded to me like you are basically, when you are doing these phone reviews, you are operating in a secure environment.
Yes, sir.
I've seen pictures. It looks like a vault, right?
Yes, sir.
There are some parts of this that are a skiff.
Sure, there are no signals coming out, so it would be...
And I'm guessing no windows, and it has heavy doors, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And that is to prevent the devices that you are working on from being manipulated while you are working on it, correct?
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
And the director of HTAU is Steve Moran, right?
He is.
And I think I've seen him say publicly that there is a real concern that investigative targets can manipulate data and their devices remotely.
Yes.
Objection.
Overruled. You can answer.
Yes.
You agree with Mr. Moran, right?
I do.
And so Here in New York, one of the top priorities for the analysis and the forensics that you are conducting is maintaining the integrity of the data.
Absolutely.
And it's important to maintain that integrity because it ultimately goes to the reliability and the evidence that you present in a criminal trial setting like this, right?
Yes,
That goes to how much weight the jury should put on it.
that's correct.
Evidence that has been subject to a risk of manipulation is less reliable, isn't it?
Certainly.
That's a basic principle of the forensic certifications that you described, right?
That is correct.
And so, in your field, there are processes and procedures that are designed to maintain the integrity of the data.
Yes, there are.
So let's talk a little bit more about the different steps in the process. Let's start with device collection, which I think is the first step, right?
That is correct.
It sometimes is called the acquisition phase,
That's correct.
meaning how does law enforcement get the device that you ultimately search, right?
That's correct.
And that could happen in a lot of ways, right?
Yes,
Law enforcement can collect a device at a crime scene, right?
that's correct.
Execute a search warrant, seize a device, and bring it to you, right?
Yes,
Issue a subpoena and collect a device and bring it to you, right?
that's correct.
Or in this case, a device was delivered to you with an authorization from Michael Cohen, right? That's how it was acquired? The two devices were acquired?
Yes, it was.
And if you got to pick from the kinds of just pure forensics, the best case scenario would be that once acquired, the device goes immediately in the vault, right?
That's correct.
It is immediately secured to be kept away from radio waves, right?
Yes,
And that, I don't want to sound crazy, but that's radio waves that we are talking about, the internet we're talking about, phone signals, right?
phone signals, yeah.
So if you got to pick the top priority, it would be, let's get the phone or phones in the vault, right?
Yes.
That can't always happen, right?
It can't.
It can be your priority, but there are other people involved in the investigation, right?
That's correct.
They have other priorities, correct?
That is absolutely correct.
And so sometimes there is a lag time,
There is,
some delays in getting the device in the vault,
yes,
some delays in getting the device protected from manipulation.
that's correct.
There are interim measures in your field for sort of protecting the device while it's in that transit process, right?
That's correct.
I think did you mention a Faraday room?
Faraday room, yes.
But there's also a Faraday bag?
There is,
So sometimes you can get the device, throw it in the bag, and it's protected from the radio signals, right?
yes.
You can do it immediately,
You can do it immediately.
and that is the soundest way to do a device acquisition, correct?
The soundest way.
One of the considerations here in the acquisition phase is chain of custody, right?
Yes.
And you know what that means?
Yep.
Chain of custody is the process by which who handles the device is tracked, right?
That's correct.
Who acquired it, right?
Yes.
Who brought it
Who brought it?
back to your office, right?
That is correct.
Who participated in the intake process, right?
Yes.
And now there are two sides of that. Somebody brings the device and somebody accepts, right? And so those are links in the chain.
Links in the chain.
The more secure the chain of custody, the more reliable the evidence, right?
One could ascertain.
But you believe that? I mean, you have been practicing this for a long time, right?
Certainly.
And you believe that to be true, don't you?
Certainly.
That is correct?
That is correct.
And a break in the chain of custody, it presents a risk, right?
It could be.
It could be a big risk, it could be a little one, but it creates a risk, and I'm not trying to quantify it right now.
That's correct.
But that's a basic principle of forensic analysis, correct?
A basic principle.
If there was a gap in of who was handling the evidence at a certain time, that's an open question, right?
Yes, it is.
Once the device is acquired and we get it into the vault, we get it into that room, the next stage is to actually extract the data, right?
Yes, it is.
And there are a couple of ways, there are a few ways to do that, right?
Yes.
One is manual extraction,
Uh-huh.
which is not really an extraction at all. It's just looking at what's on the phone physically, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Basically taking screenshots of what you can see in the phone as, like, I would look at my own phone as I was using it, right?
That's correct.
And there is equipment for that can help you take better pictures, but you really are ultimately just taking pictures of what's on the screen.
Yes.
And this is, would you say, the least sophisticated way to acquire data from an electronic device?
The less sophisticated.
And so you can't access metadata in a meaningful way, correct?
No, you can't.
And you can't recover items deleted by the user, right?
You cannot.
You can't look at the coding of specific files like an image that you see on a phone, right?
No.
So there are other ways to do this, correct?
There are.
And another one is a logical extraction.
Uh-huh.
And so for a logical extraction, you are pulling the data off of the device sort of in the same format that it looks, the same way Windows looks, right? A folder, a hierarchical formation, right?
Files, yes.
What was that?
Files.
I didn't hear you.
Files, folders.
Right. And this is, again, similar if you are looking at a logical extraction. It's similar to the way that you might look at the way you operate your PC from a Windows environment.
The same.
And so in that way, say you connect the phone to a piece of equipment in your lab, right?
That's correct.
And you pull the data off the phone, correct?
Yes,
And it brings the data on in this file folder structure?
it does.
And is one of the drawbacks to this logical extraction that it doesn't look at the unallocated space, right?
That's correct.
The unallocated space is where, I'm going to use layman's terms and you will fix it up for me, it's where the deleted stuff goes to reside.
An artifact, yes.
And an artifact is a piece of data of one of these items that you are examining, right?
Yes.
And when you do a logical extraction, one of the drawbacks is you can't tell what the user deleted or has not deleted. Isn't that right?
Correct.
Yes, it just pulls out the information that was present at the time that it was acquired.
That's correct.
And there is a better way,
Yes, a better way.
a physical acquisition.
Yes, a physical acquisition in some ways is more of an older approach for Apple iPhones. It's a full file system.
And in a full file system, you are basically pulling a forensic image of the whole memory chip.
Yeah, the whole memory chip. That's correct.
And it's a process that you connect the phone to a piece of equipment that you have, and it pulls the data out, and there is a giant, depending on how much metadata is on the phone, a giant file, right?
That's correct.
And when it gets onto that equipment, it's ones and zeros, right?
That's correct.
And so you need something to parse the data.
You do.
Parsing the data means converting ones and zeros into the types of things that you and I are used to looking at, right?
Yes.
And so pictures, right? We looked at that picture of Michael Cohen at the podium, right?
That's correct.
That came onto your machine as ones and zeros, and then you had some equipment that converted it so that you could see what the picture looked like.
Yes.
Same thing with the phone logs, right?
It's in the format on the phone, yes.
It's pulled out as ones and zeros parsed on your machine, and ultimately generates these reports that we are looking at in evidence, right?
It does.
When you are working with these, just to back up for 1 minute, so we just talked about 3 methods: manual, logical, physical. You did all of those on both of these phones, right?
I did a full file system on the phone.
You also, someone from your staff did a manual review, correct?
When I got the device, I simply plugged it into the device, pulled the extraction, and then put it away into evidence.
So there were other people from HTAU who worked on the phone and did searches?
There is. They are part of the investigative team, but not at HTAU.
And I am just trying to understand process-wise. It possible that someone outside of HTAU did manual searches on these devices?
Whoever had the phone before, some other agency, if that's what you are asking.
Well, the FBI searched both of these phones before you did, right?
I heard that they did.
You know that they did, correct?
I heard that they did, yes.
And we are going to talk about that. But what I want to focus on right now is just what happened when the phones were acquired at the district attorney's office. Okay.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about the file, the bin file, the image that's pulled off.
It's called the zip file.
The zip file, that's pulled off of the extraction. When a file is that big and it's pulled off in that way, there is some risk that the data can degrade. Is that correct?
So once the data is pulled off, it's then hashed or checks are done, which means that entire file gets a very unique number that says this is the hash that contains all these contents. If anything was affected, that hash file would change.
Thank you. That's right where I was going. So the hash value associated with the particular giant zip file is like a digital fingerprint, right?
It's a digital fingerprint.
Maybe even more detailed, like DNA for us, right?
Sure.
If you trust the hash system you are using, if one of those files with ones or zeros changes, it's a different hash value, correct?
That's correct.
And this is a way to check on an ongoing basis the integrity of the data that you are working with, right?
Absolutely.
And it's a way to ensure that over points in time during the acquisition and review process that the data itself has not been manipulated, right?
Each time you look at it, it hashes or verifies it each time you look at it.
That is an automatic process, right?
It's automatic.
Just the check mark? Yes, the hashes match. Correct?
That's correct.
And that's because these hashes, if you are really being secure about it, they are very, very long sets of numbers and letters, right?
Yes, they are.
You don't want to spend a lot of time checking those numbers and letters one by one, right?
You do not.
The computer does it for you. But it's as if, say, fingerprints that match. If the hash is the same, these are the same two types of this is the same file, right?
That's correct.
And so you testified today about some of the artifacts that you extracted from 2 phones that were acquired from Michael Cohen, right?
Yes, I did.
And these artifacts are segments of a much broader set data that was pulled off of each phone, correct?
They are just segments.
That's because you are able to, once the data is parsed, you can use the program to select what the pieces of it are that you want to highlight, right?
You can.
So we have certain excerpts, but not the whole phone, correct?
That's correct.
You pulled certain excerpts that you were instructed to pull by the prosecutors, right?
Of course.
And you don't know, do you, why they picked certain things and not others?
I'm not part of the investigative team.
And you are not a part of the investigative team. And there are also situations where the evidence raises questions, but they are not your questions to answer, right?
That's correct.
And so, just as an example, the government played a recording from September 6th of 2016. That was the metadata associated with that file, right? Do you remember that?
Yes, it was.
And there was a transcript associated with that, and we put that up on the screen, and as we listened, the audio cuts off, right?
Towards the end, yeah.
And you don't have firsthand knowledge of why it cuts off, right?
I don't. I mean, I heard a phone call was coming in. That's all I know.
So somebody gave you some instructions.
That's correct.
About why the phone was cut off, right?
Yes.
But as a result, you know that that wasn't the whole conversation, correct?
That's correct.
And you don't know what was going on before or after, right?
I do not.
And you were instructed, were you not, to check the phone itself, the physical device, to see if there was incoming or outgoing calls on it around the time of that recording?
I wasn't instructed per se to look at the calls coming in at that time.
You, at one point, you prepared a report, did you not, of all incoming and outgoing calls on CP1, the device from which that recording was extracted?
Yes, those reports were pulled after.
And you found a call around the time of the recording on the physical device, correct?
I wasn't specifically asked to look at that.
But you do know that the recording cuts off, and you don't know what happened after that, right?
Just that it cut off.
And you don't know what was going on before that?
That's correct.
I want to now get back to the actual acquisition process for these 2 devices. These came to HTAU on January 23rd of 2023, right?
They did come to our office, yes.
And I'm being a little imprecise. There are 2 iPhones, right?
That's right.
If I say CP1 and CP2, you will know what I mean?
I will.
And at the time these phones came to HTAU, is it your testimony that you were not provided with the copies that the FBI had seized?
Yeah, I did not receive those.
You did not have access to the data that the FBI seized from these devices in 2018, did you?
I did not.
And you did not ask for that data, did you?
I did not.
And you didn't ask any questions about what the FBI had done to the devices in 2018, correct?
That is correct.
And this acquisition process, there are so many different ways to do it. Some of the acquisition processes are more invasive than others, right?
Yes.
Well,
manually looking at a device is invasive.
And so just to clarify, when I was using the term manual earlier, I mean taking some pictures on the top of the phone?
That's correct.
There are also really invasive methods, other types of methods, right?
Right.
Rip the phone apart, right?
For Androids, not for Apple iPhones.
And that's a specific situation where you really can't do a second search, right?
That's correct.
And in addition to there being acquisition processes that are particularly invasive, there is room for user error in the acquisition process, right?
Sure.
And so if somebody makes a mistake at one point in the acquisition, that can affect the data, correct?
It could.
And that is why, for example, you are in these Faraday rooms, right?
Uh-huh, that's correct.
That's why you received a lot of training, right?
That's correct.
And there is at least a risk that a prior acquisition and extraction could impact the data that you looked at in 2023, isn't there?
That's correct.
And you didn't talk to the FBI about the methods they used, did you?
I did not.
And as far as you know, nobody at this table did?
As far as I know.
It's an open question?
That it is.
Is this a good time?
Yes, Judge.
All right. Jurors, we are going to stop here. Call it a day. Okay, let's get the witness, please.
Witness entering. Watch your step. Remain, raise your right hand, and face the court clerk.
You were already sworn in, right?
Yes.
All right, you can have a seat. All right, I'm sorry. I remind you that you are still under Let's Get the Jury, please. All rise. Jury entering. Jury enters. Please be seated.
Do both sides stipulate that the jury is present and properly seated?
Yes.
Yes.
Good morning, jurors. Welcome back. I apologize for keeping you waiting. I know that you got here a little bit early today, and I know that you were waiting for a little thank you, but we are ready now. Mr. Bove.
Thank you, Judge. May I inquire?
Please.
Good morning, Mr. Daus.
Good morning.
Yesterday we were talking about two cell you analyzed, right?
Yes, sir.
And I think we were referring to them as CP1 for cell phone 1 and CP2 for cell phone 2.
Yes.
And both phones were delivered to HTAU in that intake process on January 23rd of 2023, correct?
Yes, they were.
And searches of those phones were authorized pursuant to a consent form signed by Michael Cohen, right?
Yes.
And both of the devices, CP1 and CP2, were delivered to HTAU by Jeremy Rosenberg, is that right?
Yes.
And let's focus on CP1, which is the phone with the gold backing, right?
That's correct.
Do you recall that Mr. Conroy showed you the consent form that Michael Cohen signed, which is relating to that phone yesterday?
Yes.
And do you recall that Cohen signed that form on January 19th of 2023?
Yes.
That's the form relating to CP1?
Correct.
And do you recall that he signed the form about 9:05 that morning on January 19th?
I believe so.
And it's your understanding, is it not, that at the time that he signed the form, he turned CP1 over to Mr. Rosenberg, correct?
Yes.
And so there is a gap there between the 19th, when Mr. Rosenberg took possession of the phone, and the 23rd, when it was delivered to HTAU, right?
That's correct.
And we talked yesterday about the chain of custody. Do you remember that?
I do.
And so, as far as you know, for this piece of the chain, it's on Mr. Rosenberg for that period of about 4 days, right?
Correct.
And that, from a forensic perspective, I think what you said is your ideal situation would be when the phone is acquired, it's immediately delivered to HTAU so it can be in a secure environment, right?
Ideally.
And there is a gap, isn't there, in your understanding of what happened to the phone during that period?
There is.
And it's not ideal from a forensic perspective to have a gap like that because you don't know what happened to the data?
Correct.
Getting back to that form, Mr. Rosenberg signed that form, right?
Yes.
And there was a second place on the form for a second witness, right?
Yes, there was.
With no signature, correct?
I can't recall.
If we take, this is just Mr. Burnick, the court, the parties, and the witness, if we could just take a look at Defense Exhibit G15, and if you could take a look at that, the question is, does that refresh your recollection about second witness spot in the form and the fact that it's blank?
That's correct.
And so, can we take that down? Thanks, so there wasn't a second witness on the form, right?
There wasn't.
And that is not standard from a forensics perspective either, correct?
Sometimes.
Meaning sometimes only one member of the district attorney's office collects the phone, is that right?
Yes.
And in that situation, like the one we have here with CP1, there is only one witness who knows what happened during that collection process, right?
Yes.
Well, there is one witness from the district attorney's office,
One signature.
Mr. Rosenberg, and then there is another witness, Michael Cohen, right?
That's correct.
And the reason that is not an ideal way to handle it in this fashion is that if there is a dispute about what happened during the acquisition, it's sort of what Mr. Rosenberg said versus what Mr. Cohen said, right?
Theoretically.
And so the reason that there is a second witness space on that form is that in an ideal situation, from a forensic perspective, you would have two witnesses in a position to say, this is what happened when I picked up the phone.
Ideally.
And we don't have that here.
We don't have that.
And so during that period, the January 19th through the 23rd, you don't know if the phone was powered on or off, right?
I do not.
You don't know if it was in a Faraday bag, correct?
I do not.
You don't know if it was hooked up with the internet or not, right?
I do not.
Now, we talked yesterday about a manual review process for phones, taking pictures of what the contents of the phone are, right?
Sometimes, yes.
And I asked you, do you recall whether somebody at HTAU did a manual review of CP1? Do you remember that?
I don't recall anybody at HTAU doing a manual review.
And I would like to show you, just Mr. Burnick, this is for the court, the parties, and the witness, Defense Exhibit G17, please. And I want to see if that refreshes your recollection about a manual review process.
Okay. So after we had taken an image, right, these are snapshots that we take of the device after we do the extraction. We then load it into the same software, and we use the software to take screenshots.
And so these on Defense G17 are images of the face of the phone in different states at the time you got it on or around January 23rd. Is that your understanding?
That would be correct, yes.
And so you testified yesterday that you found a Signal app on this phone, right?
There was.
And you said that the Signal app allows users to conduct encrypted communication, correct?
Yes.
And to send something encrypted is communications, which allows users to send communications to explode or self-delete?
On some of them, you can do that, yes.
It's a user option, correct?
It is.
And when that happens, when Signal is set up in that fashion, it becomes, and the messages are deleted by the app. It is very difficult for a forensic technician like yourself to recover the messages, right?
It is very difficult.
And Telegram, which you said was on CP1, correct?
Yes.
It has a similar function, right?
It can, if set by the user.
It's a user option to set messages to delete or disappear from the phone, right?
You can.
And do you recall that Mr. Cohen had a, quote, self-destruct timer set up in the Telegram app?
I do not recall.
Mr. Bernick, this is for the parties, the court, and the witness, please. If you could take a look at Defense Exhibit G4, and there is an entry where the numbers are in green. Do you see that?
I do.
And does that refresh your recollection about the self-destruct timer that Mr. Cohen set up?
Yes, there appears to be a self-destruct timer on that particular conversation.
And at least for that conversation, it was set up to self-destruct in 7 seconds. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
Do you recall that there was also an app installed on CP1 called Dust?
Dust, I do not recall.
Mr. Bernick, if you could please bring up for the witness, the parties, and the court, Defense Exhibit G3. Does that refresh your recollection about the Dust app?
Those are the apps that were running in the background. Correct. It looks like it had not logged in. It was prepared to be set up. Maybe it was installed, but it just was not set up.
Or it's possibly, like you said, right, in the beginning of the answer, that he had logged out and just needed to log back in, right?
That's correct.
And were you familiar with the Dust app at the time of this review?
Not at the time of the review.
Are you now familiar with it?
I am now.
And you are aware, are you not, that this is another app with a function that allows a user setting to delete the messages very quickly after they are set, right?
You can.
You can set that up that the message self-deletes when it's read by the other party, right?
That's correct.
And in that instance, it would be virtually possible for someone in your position to recover data on the phone relating to those messages, correct?
That's correct.
Now, I want to talk about the data you extracted from CP1, okay?
Yes.
You testified yesterday that you did not obtain copies of the data that the FBI had seized from this same device, right?
I had not.
And we talked about hash values yesterday, correct?
That's correct.
And so, in the absence of having that other copy, you couldn't compare the hashes to see if the data had been manipulated, correct?
That's correct.
You could not compare the two different data sets to determine if the data had degraded between 2018 and 2023, correct?
I cannot.
Do you know what a factory reset is?
I do.
What, for a cell phone, what is a factory reset?
A factory reset is when you, let's say, got a new phone, you want to retire this particular phone, you can go in and set, many of you perhaps have iPhones, you can actually go in and do a reset, so it resets the phone back to the factory settings.
And the factory reset setting can also be used to essentially delete user data from a phone, correct?
That is correct.
And it sometimes is called wiping the phones, right?
Same thing as a wipe.
And by wipe, you mean wipe all of the data off the phone, correct?
It does.
And yesterday you testified about an audio file that you said had a date associated HIT September 6th, 2016. Do you remember that?
I do.
And you know the file that I'm talking about?
I do.
Do you recall that there was a factory reset of CP1 on October 15th, 2016?
Yes, there was.
So subsequent to the date associated with that file, there was a wipe of CP1, correct?
Yes, there was.
By the user of the phone, right?
Correct.
And as far as you know, that's Michael Cohen, right?
Could have been.
Well, he was the user of the phone, right?
He was the user.
And he provided the password to the phone, right?
Yes.
You don't have any information that somebody else wiped CP1, right? Do you?
I do not.
Just yes or no, that sequencing the date associated with that audio file relative to the wiping of the phone raises some questions about that file, right?
You have to then look at where that file came from.
Right. It raises some questions that require further analysis. Fair?
That's correct.
Do you recall that there was some kind of backup loaded onto CP1 in January of 2017?
I do.
And that was on January 25th, 2017, correct?
That's correct.
And on the same day, January 25th, 2017, there was a sync performed on the phone, right?
That's correct.
And a sync is a situation where a user can connect a phone to a laptop, right?
That's correct.
And move data from the laptop onto the device, correct?
Yes.
And in this instance, with CP1, in the sync that happened in January of 2017, the phone was connected to a laptop with a user named Michael.Cohen, right?
Yes.
And so, more than 4 months after the date that you have associated with this audio file, there was some kind of sync where Mr. Cohen plugged the phone into his laptop and loaded some files from the laptop, right?
Right. When you plug it into iTunes, it does a full backup of whatever that backup is that you are restoring from iTunes and restores everything back to that phone. So that file got restored at that time.
That's one way just to do a sync, right? But there are many ways that that transfer process could have occurred, correct?
From what I know, it is generally a complete iTunes backup. Normally, people don't select things. They select the entire thing.
But you don't know what happened here?
An entire backup happened.
Right. And you don't know what the backup entailed, correct?
Meaning?
Meaning you don't know what was transferred onto the phone in January 2017?
That file, certainly.
We are going to come back to the metadata associated with the September 6th file.
Uh-huh.
But I want to talk about the laptop a little bit. You didn't collect Michael Cohen laptop, right?
I did not.
And you know that Michael Cohen is cooperating with the district attorney's office, correct?
Sure, he's consenting to the phones. He's cooperating.
He's going to testify at this trial on behalf of the government, right?
Yes.
And so you know that there was the possibility to ask Mr. Cohen for the laptop, right?
There certainly could be.
Certainly, if you had the laptop, you could know with a lot of precision all of the things that Mr. Cohen loaded onto the phone in January of 2017, right?
I could.
But that did not happen here, correct?
No, it did not.
And so you testified yesterday that there were 39,745 contacts saved on CP1, right?
I did.
And I think you said that was unusual, correct?
It is.
But isn't it a fact that that is entirely consistent with Michael Cohen dumping a bunch of data from his laptop onto this phone?
It's the contacts that are assigned in his iCloud account that over the years have accumulated to that many contents.
Yes, over the years on the laptop, right?
In whatever the account that he used to log in, yes.
And we can only guess because neither of us have seen the laptop, right?
That's correct.
But when you have testified that the number of contacts was unusual, one potential explanation for the unusual nature of the number of contacts is this laptop syncing, correct?
It could be.
So let's talk some more about this audio file, all right. Think you had acknowledged yesterday that the file cuts off mid-conversation, correct?
Towards the end of it.
Well, how do you know if it's towards the end of the conversation?
Because when you listen to the whole thing in the last 46 seconds and then it cuts off.
Right. So you just mean the conversation cuts off at the end of the audio file, just to clarify?
That's correct.
You don't know how long the conversation continued, correct?
No, I don't.
You are aware that a transcript of that audio file was released to the public by Michael Cohen's lawyers in 2018, right?
I had heard.
Do you recall a news coverage relating to that release?
I don't.
I'm sorry?
I don't.
Mr. Bernick, for the court, the witness, and the parties, if we could please bring up Defense G19. I will ask you to take a look at that, and I will ask you, does this refresh your recollection as to, in July 2018, Michael Cohen and his attorneys released what purported to be a transcript of the recording that you testified about?
Objection.
Overruled. You can answer.
Yeah, I don't certainly remember that article coming out, but that appears to be the article about such event.
It looks like it happened, right?
It does.
Objection.
Sustained.
So this indicates that Cohen and his attorneys in 2018 were handling this file external to the phone, correct?
Objection.
Overruled.
External to the phone?
Meaning they sent it to the media in the summer of 2018, right?
Could have, yes.
And the file was out there, correct?
And the file was out there.
And it looks like it was being, when I say it's external to the phone, what I mean is it was sent out to the public and there was a process by which it was removed from the phone to get it out there.
It was copied off of it, apparently.
You testified yesterday that you heard that there was an incoming phone call on a device around the time of this recording?
Yes.
And I just want to clarify, there is no exhibit that you offered that you didn't offer anything. There is no exhibit that you testified about that reflects an artifact from CPL relating to this phone call that you've heard about.
Repeat that question, I'm sorry.
None of the exhibits that you offered reflect data from the phone itself as relating to such a phone call, correct?
No.
And so your forensic analysis of the device did not reveal any such call, right?
That's correct.
And when I say any such call, I mean a call that could be interpreted to interfere with the recording that you've testified about?
That's correct.
And so, because that's the case, you were not in a position to do any forensic analysis about the interplay between the Voice Notes app and any purported phone call on September 6th, 2016, because the data just wasn't there, right?
That's right.
Mr. Bernick, can we please bring up Government 247, which is in evidence? This is the metadata associated with this September 6th recording, right?
Yes, it is.
And this is metadata that you extracted from the physical device CP1, right?
Yes, it is.
And this exhibit does not indicate when the audio file was last modified, right?
Last modified, the timestamp that it appears is the name of the file. So when the voice recording memo records the file, an audio file, it actually embeds the timestamp that the recording was made. In this case, it would have been 2016. So September 6th at approximately 10:56. So wherever that file existed on an iPhone associated with that account got restored, as mentioned before, back onto this device. One of the columns you look at is that source file information. When that comes over from the backup, you will see the same date and time if that recording was modified or edited at some point later, and adding something or deleting something, you would then have timestamps that reflect that time it was edited. But in this case, this particular file shows the same metadata information about the time.
Judge, I move to strike all of that as non-responsive.
Overruled.
You just testified about your theories of the timestamp on the screen, right?
I did.
That is your hypothesis, correct?
It's my experience, yes.
And look, you have a ton of experience with forensic science, right?
Yes.
And so you are testifying as a scientist who is trying to draw some inferences from what you see on the screen, right?
Correct.
This report, my question was, does this report reflect a date modified at all?
No, just the timestamp when it was created.
Now, I would like to look at another metadata report that's in evidence. So, Mr. Bernick, if we could bring up Government Exhibit 253 in the top pane and 252 at the bottom. And so this is the photograph that you testified about yesterday, right?
It was.
And you said that's Michael Cohen at the top?
Yes.
And in the bottom, Government's 252, that is a report, the metadata associated with that file, right?
Yes, it is.
And if we could zoom in on the 6th column beginning modified date, please. Do you see those columns?
I do.
And so that is information with respect to that image about the date it was modified, created, and accessed, right?
That's correct.
And so those are fields that were generated for this image when you ran the report for the metadata associated with the image, correct?
That's correct.
And when you ran the report associated with the metadata linked to the audio file, it did not generate those fields, correct?
It did not.
Do you recall that there was also a properties list file associated with this audio file saved on the phone?
There is a property list that contains information, yes.
And there was a file associated with the audio file entitled Manifest P List or Property List?
Yes.
Do you recall that?
Yes.
And that's a particular type of file that relates to a phone sync, right?
Yes.
And it can provide some information about the timing of this sync process that we talked about between a laptop and a phone like CP1, correct?
That's correct.
And so we've talked about it, a sync that we know occurred between CP1 and Michael Cohen's computer on January of 2017, right?
That's correct.
Do you recall that there is a separate property list file that reflects a date of October 17th, 2020?
I do not.
Mr. Bernick, this is for the court, the witness, and the parties, please. If you can take a look at Government Exhibit G11. And so, just so we can get oriented here, you are probably more familiar with this than I am. This is a file list in the left pane, and you can see highlighted is the audio files itself, right?
Yes,
And so this is metadata associated with the audio file, correct?
it is.
And so in the right pane, you see a last access time of January 25th, 2017, correct?
That's correct.
So let's take a look at page 2, please. And now, in that left pane, do you see there is a folder with the name of the audio file?
That's correct.
And in that folder is a file called manifest plist, right?
There is.
Plist means property list, correct?
Yes,
And you said a minute ago that that contained information about the timing of a sync, right?
it can. Yes.
And so if you see that on the right, in the right pane, there is a window with file information associated with the manifest plist file.
I do.
Can I pause briefly to apologize to the court reporter? Do you see the date associated with that?
I do.
And the dates are October 17th, 2020, right?
That's correct.
And so this reflects another sync between a laptop and this phone, CPL, right?
Yes.
And you have presented no information in the exhibits that have come in through the government about that sync, right?
I have not.
And you testified that the first sync in 2017 was from a laptop associated with Michael Cohen, right?
That's correct.
A laptop you don't have, right?
Yes.
A laptop you have not been able to examine, right?
No.
And now we are talking about a sync in 2020 on this phone. We don't know what it was from, correct?
I do not.
You could only guess?
Based on this file, I do not.
And we would have to take Michael Cohen's word for whatever happened in October of 2020 with respect to this phone, right?
It seems so.
Do you recall if this phone was actually powered on in September of 2020?
September of 2020, it could have been. I do not know.
And I want to refresh your recollection about that. But first, let's talk about the significance of the fact that you are performing forensic analysis of a phone in January of 2023 relating to files in 2016, right?
That's correct.
And there are these intervening events that we're talking about, correct?
That's correct.
And they present questions about the reliability of the evidence, correct?
It would seem so.
And that is these, as a practitioner in your science, these are questions to be addressed, right?
Certainly.
So let's take a look. Mr. Bernick, this is for the court, the party, and the witness, please, as Defense Exhibit G12. And do you recognize this as being from the timeline review of the Celebrite report relating to CPL?
Yes.
And there is a highlighted row here. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Would it tell me if you need me to zoom in on anything?
I can see.
Okay. This shows that the phone was not only turned on, but actually used in 2020, right?
Yes, it does.
September 30th, 2020. Correct?
That's correct.
And if you look at the source file information, that's calling for the highlighted cell. There is a file. I can't really see it.
Shine 2, M4A.
Thank you. That's an audio file, right?
It is.
That's an extension associated with an audio file?
Yes, it is.
And so, in September of 2020, this is well after 2016, well after the FBI searches in 2018, and long before you were given the phone, this phone was on, being used to do something with the recording, correct?
It was.
And we don't know what, right?
I do not.
And we would have to take Michael Cohen's word for correct?
It would seem so.
Do you recall that this phone was turned on again in 2022?
I do not.
Mr. Bernick, this is for the court, the parties, and the witness. And if we could take a look at Defense G13, and I will ask you to take a look at that. And the question is, does this refresh your recollection that the device was turned on again on March 28th, 2022?
Yes, it was.
And this is a situation, is it not, where the device was used to make a recording, right?
Yes, it was.
And if you look at the recording pane on the far right side, that says there is a recording that was created that was 40 minutes and 50 seconds, right?
That is correct.
So this phone was turned on in 2022 again, right?
That's correct.
Used by Michael Cohen, correct?
Yes, it was.
To make a recording, correct?
To make a recording.
And you don't know what he was doing, do you?
I do not.
And this is far from ideal from a forensic perspective. If you are trying to determine in a reliable fashion what went on with this phone in 2016, correct?
If something happened in 2016 on the device, that file is going to be saved on that device.
Right. And this phone has been synced multiple times, turned on and off since that time. All sorts of things have happened that create variables that in your ideal situation would be investigated, correct?
Certainly.
Including this laptop that Michael Cohen had. What's on it? What got loaded onto the phone, right? Those are questions from your perspective.
Objection.
Sustained.
The things that I've shown you this morning raise some questions about how this phone was handled, right?
Yes.
And this phone was not handled through no fault of your own. You took possession of this phone in January 2023, right?
That's correct. 2023.
And you have extensive training and best practices for how to handle electronic evidence like this, correct?
I do.
And in your ideal situation, if you were asked to analyze data from 2015 and 2016, the things that happened subsequent to this phone, the FBI search, the syncing multiple times, the factory reset, the phone being powered on and off by the user, subsequent to all of these things, those all present real challenges to understanding this data, right?
It would have to be taken into account.
And in many ways, we are just going to have to take Michael Cohen's word for it, aren't we?
Yes.
Nothing further, Judge.
Thank you. Any redirect?
Yes, thank you, Judge. Good morning, Mr. Daus.
Good morning.
Good to see you again. You were just asked a series of questions about if you knew what Michael Cohen was doing at various points over the last 5 years. Take it you are not a friend of Michael Cohen's?
I'm not.
So you don't hang around with him to track what he's doing on a daily basis?
I do not.
You were also asked a series of questions about a phone being turned on and turned off and used. Is it unusual for a phone to be used?
No.
Is it unusual for a phone to be used to make recordings?
No.
Now you were asked a series of questions just towards the end of Mr. Bove's cross-examination about other recordings that were made on this phone. Is that right?
Yes.
But those are noted, the recordings that are at issue here in this case. Is that right?
That's correct.
Want to talk for a minute? You were asked some questions about the end of the phone call between the defendant and Michael Cohen that we played the other day, and sort of how it ended and how it sort of cut off at the end?
Yes.
We also put into evidence some call logs from the phone?
Correct.
From a WhatsApp application, is that right?
That's right.
You wanted to see if a call came into a particular phone number at a particular time, a long time ago? What would be the best thing to look at to see if that happened?
A call detail record from the carrier.
So that's not something that resides on the phone itself, is that right?
That's correct.
You were talking about the phone records from Verizon or AT&T?
Yes.
That would be the best place to look to see if a phone call came into a particular phone number at a particular time that may have interrupted a recording?
That's the best source.
Now, you were asked over the last couple of hours, yesterday and today, a number of questions about things like Faraday bags and special rooms and the care that has to be taken. And it's all true. It's very important to be careful when we are collecting evidence, correct?
It is.
Is there a difference when evidence is collected pursuant to a search warrant and when it's collected pursuant to a consent form?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Well, a consent form is just simply a user is offering their phones. They provide the code and we can perform the full extraction of that device.
And what about when there is a search warrant?
In a search warrant, you may not have the code. It may be a hostile environment. You have to, depending on exigent circumstances, do things to a device with that search warrant that you may not from a consent form, different things.
And with a search warrant, the phone is often taken not with the consent form of the owner if the phone is taken pursuant to a court order. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I want to go back to, again, the recording that we played at the end of the day yesterday that had the defendant speaking to Mr. Cohen, the evidence in this case that's in as People's 246. The examination that you did, first of all, you were working on a full forensic extraction of the device, right?
That's correct.
And is that the gold standard as far as you are concerned about what you can look at?
Yes, it is.
And you looked at the metadata for that file. You looked at various artifacts that were in that full forensic extraction.
Yes, I did.
Did you see any evidence of tampering or manipulation on any of the data that you pulled related to the recording that's in evidence as People's 246?
I object and ask to be heard at sidebar.
Sure, please.
At sidebar.
If I could just hear the question because I got a little distracted.
I'm sorry.
Can you read back the last question?
Did you see any evidence of tampering or manipulation on any of the data that you pulled related to the recording that's in evidence as People's 246?
Thank you. Okay.
The objection, Judge, is that we are getting to a point where an expert opinion is being elicited from this witness. We are allowed to cross-examine and impeach the reliability of the evidence through this witness. That witness. He's not an expert. He can't offer an opinion like that.
He's, I think, talking about the facts of what he saw and what he did in his examination. And this is responsive to the cross-examination and he can talk about his training and experience, which is extensive.
You did a very effective job of cross-examining this witness. I think the people have the right to try and rehabilitate the witness and bring out some facts. If I recall correctly, during your cross-examination at one point, you even referred to him as an expert. The objection is overruled.
Sidebar concluded.
The objection is overruled.
Could we have that last question read back when you are ready?
Did you see any evidence of tampering or manipulation on any of the data that you pulled related to the recording that's in evidence as People's 246?
I did not.
Did you see any evidence of tampering or manipulation with respect to any of the data on the phone related to any of the exhibits that were put into evidence yesterday?
I did not.
Just one moment, please.
ADAs confer.
Thank you very much, Judge. I have nothing further.
Mr. Bove.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Daus, let me just ask you, you were just asked questions about whether you observed evidence of tampering on CP1, right?
That's correct.
But my questions were more about variables that are unanswered in connection with the data on that phone, right?
Yes.
Unknowns, correct?
Unknowns.
So I am asking not about whether you saw affirmative tampering. My question is, did you see gaps in the handling of this data that created risks for such tampering?
Yes.
This recording that we talked about a lot this morning, September 6th of 2016, we can agree, can't we, that it cuts off mid-conversation, right?
Towards the end.
The file towards the end has a disconnect between the conversation that is ongoing and the audio file stops?
That is correct.
You don't know what happened in the conversation after that?
I don't know. There is no file.
And someone has told you about a phone call that allegedly caused the recorder to cut off, right?
Yes.
And that's your working understanding and part of the basis for your testimony, right?
That's correct.
And you were asked a question by Mr. Conroy, what's the best source of evidence to figure out if that phone call happened, right?
Correct.
And you said tools, you go to the phone company and you get the tools, right?
The call detail records.
But there is no record of that call on the device itself?
That's correct.
So that is another variable, isn't it?
It is.
And the variable, the thing that the tools does not address, is why there is a call at some phone company that's not reflected in the data itself that you looked at, right?
That's correct.
That is an open question, right?
Yes.
And we don't know?
We don't.
And because we don't know, you were not able to look at the way that the Voice Notes app interacted with the incoming call function, right?
Correct.
We don't know?
Correct. We don't know.
Nothing further.
Very briefly. Mr. Daus, would you, if I made a phone call 7 years ago from the phone in my pocket, would you expect to see a log of that call on my phone, assuming that I used my phone?
I would not.
You would not.
No.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
Thank you, sir. You can step down.
Witness is excused.